In the stifling heat of a summer afternoon, the scent of exhaust fumes filled the streets of downtown Atlanta. The city pulsed with life, its sidewalks bustling with hurried feet and the hum of car engines whizzing by. But amid this ordinary scene, an ordinary day became anything but. It wasn't the heat that made the air thick with tension, nor the noise of the city that felt louder than it ever had before. It was the unsettling presence of a single squad car. Its siren had yet to wail, but the unspoken words it carried rang louder than any siren could ever manage. Chris had lived in this neighborhood his whole life. He knew its cracks and crevices better than anyone. His neighborhood wasn't always the most glamorous. It wasn't the place that tourists flocked to or that the city's elites bragged about. But it was home. And in that familiarity, he had come to understand the language of his block, the unspoken rhythm of who belonged and who didn't, of who was seen and who was overlooked. But lately, it seemed as though even the simplest of things, like walking down his own street, had begun to feel like an accusation. It was that afternoon when Chris first saw the cop car. He was heading to the corner store, his pockets empty except for his phone and a few crumpled bills he'd scrounged together. He didn't think much of it at first. It was just another patrol car, like the dozens that had passed by his neighborhood every day, a routine so entrenched in the city's pulse that it barely raised an eyebrow. But today was different. This car wasn't just passing through, it had stopped. And, before he could make sense of it, he noticed the officer's eyes narrowing in his direction. A surge of dread washed over him. This was no ordinary stop. He could feel it in the way the officer watched him, his gaze cold and measuring, as if Chris's very presence was an affront to his own sense of order. The officer didn't even need to speak. The way he leaned against the car, one hand resting on his belt, the other holding a pen poised just above the pad, was enough. Chris wasn't just a man walking down the street. He was a suspect, his skin the only evidence needed to make a case. As Chris walked closer, the officer straightened. The air between them thickened, charged with an energy that neither man had created, but that neither could escape. Chris had seen this look before, on the faces of his peers, in the whispers that swirled around his block, in the way people avoided his eyes when they crossed the street. It was the look of someone who had been judged before they even spoke, before they even took a step. "You got ID?" The officer's voice sliced through the silence. The words weren't a question, they were a demand. Chris's throat tightened. He hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to cause trouble. He didn't want to escalate things. But he wasn't a criminal. He wasn't anything but a man trying to go about his day. "I'm just heading to the store, officer," he said, his voice steady but his heart racing. "I don't have my ID on me." The officer's eyes narrowed further, lips pulling into a thin, unforgiving line. "You don't have your ID on you?" he repeated, his voice rising with incredulity, as though the very idea that Chris, a young black man, could exist in this world without the proper documentation was somehow offensive. "No, sir," Chris said quietly, his hands twitching by his sides, unsure of what to do with them. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward Chris, his boots crunching against the pavement like they were deliberately loud, creating a rhythm that matched the thudding in Chris's chest. The moment the officer stepped closer, the tension exploded in Chris's gut. He felt like a rat in a trap. The cop was too close, his presence looming. "You seem nervous," the officer commented, his voice dripping with suspicion. "What's a young man like you doing here?" Chris stiffened. The insinuation hung in the air like smoke. He was just walking down the street, but to the officer, it wasn't that simple. He was a black man, and that alone meant he was a threat. A threat to what exactly? To peace? To order? To the comfort of someone who had grown up never questioning his authority? Chris opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He had no words for this. How could he explain the weight of years of mistrust, of criminalization? How could he tell this officer that he wasn't just some random person in his way, that he was part of a system designed to break him down, to see him as less than? "I've seen you around," the officer said after a beat, his voice cold, calculating. "You ever been arrested?" Chris's stomach lurched. The officer didn't wait for an answer. He just stood there, scanning him from head to toe, his eyes lingering just a bit too long, as if he were cataloging every possible reason to haul Chris in. "I'm gonna need you to step over here," the officer said, taking a step toward him. For the first time in his life, Chris felt fear grip him so tightly that it nearly took his breath away. The officer's voice was low, and though he hadn't raised it yet, Chris could sense the impending violence in the air. It was there in the way the cop's fingers brushed his belt, in the way his gaze flickered to the radio on his shoulder. It wasn't just a stop anymore. This was a confrontation. Chris didn't move. "Is there a problem?" he asked, trying to sound confident, though his voice trembled slightly. The officer looked at him as though Chris had just spoken in a foreign language. "You got a problem with me?" he asked, stepping even closer, his presence suffocating. "Are you being disrespectful?" Chris shook his head, taking a deep breath. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer's eyes flashed with something between irritation and disdain. Then, without warning, he reached for Chris's arm, grabbing it firmly and yanking him toward the squad car. The pressure in Chris's chest tightened, and his thoughts screamed to run. But he couldn't move. The officer's grip was like iron, unyielding. "What are you doing?" Chris's voice cracked as he protested, his words desperate. "Shut up," the officer snapped. "You're being difficult. You need to learn your place." In an instant, it felt as though the world around Chris had collapsed. The sounds of the bustling city faded, replaced by a deafening ring of fear and anger. The cop didn't care about what was right. He didn't care about Chris's humanity, his dignity, or his rights. All that mattered was the authority he held in that moment, the power to decide who was guilty before they even had a chance to explain themselves. Chris felt his knees buckle, the weight of years of injustice crashing down on him all at once. It wasn't just about this one encounter, this one officer. It was about every unjust stop, every unfair assumption, every moment of degradation that black men like him faced every single day. As the officer shoved him into the back of the squad car, Chris couldn't stop the wave of rage that threatened to overtake him. Rage at the system, at the history that had built these walls of fear and hate, at the endless stream of black men who had been wrongfully accused, beaten, and murdered, all in the name of a justice that didn't belong to them. He had never felt so small, so powerless. But in that moment, in the crushing weight of the officer's hand on his shoulder, Chris knew one thing for certain. He would not let this be the end of his story. Not today. Not ever. He wouldn't be a statistic. He wouldn't be one of those names that faded into the void of injustice. He would fight, even if it meant shouting louder than the sirens that screamed at him from all sides. But that fight, that battle for his humanity, had just begun. And the road ahead would be long, painful, and filled with resistance. But Chris was ready. He had no other choice.